Kang Dojin woke in a medical bay that hummed with technology far beyond anything humans had ever created. And for a long moment, he simply lay still and marveled at the fact that he was alive. The wound in his side was gone, replaced by smooth skin that showed no trace of the injury that had nearly killed him. The burns on his back had healed completely. And even the old ache in his knee from a rescue gone wrong 15 years ago had vanished at Valith. Medicine was apparently as advanced as the legends claim it. Surith was there when he opened his eyes, sitting in a chair beside his bed with a datapad in her lap and a smile on her blue face. "You slept for 2 days," she said. And her translator was working perfectly now, every word clear and musical. "My father's physicians say you were very close to death when they began treatment." "Your father," Dojin said. And memory came flooding back. "The High Counselor, he wants to see you," Sarah said. As soon as you were strong enough to walk, Dojin sat up slowly, testing his body and finding it stronger than it had been in years. "I think I'm strong enough now." The formal chamber looked different in the light of what Dojin now understood was a new date. Officers who had treated him as a criminal stood at attention along the walls, their expressions carefully neutral. And at the center of the room waited High Counselor Varanthus with his daughter at his side. Dojin walked toward them on steady legs, still wearing the simple medical gown they had given him. And he felt strangely calm despite standing before one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, Kang Dojin of Earth. Varanthus said, and his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. "You stand before the assembled officers of the Valith sovereignty as a witness to a moment that will be recorded in our histories forever." Dojin bowed his head slightly, unsure of the proper protocol, but wanting to show respect. "I am honored," he said simply. "You should not be honored," Varanthus said. And there was something strange in his voice. "Because what I am about to do should have been done the moment you were brought aboard this vessel." The High Counselor stepped forward, and to the shock of every Valith in the room, he bowed not a small bow of greeting or acknowledgement, but a deep formal bow that bent his tall frame nearly in half. The officers along the walls gasped, and Dojin heard whispers of disbelief racing through the crowd. A High Counselor had not bowed to anyone in living memory, and certainly never to an alien in the traditions of my people. Varanthus said as he straightened, "There is no greater gift than life, and there is no greater debt than the one owed to those who give such a gift freely. And I find myself in a position I never imagined I would occupy." He gestured, and an attendant came forward bearing a small silver case. Among the Valith, when someone saves the life of a family member without expectation of reward, they are granted a status called kinbound, and this binds them to the family as surely as blood, granting them all the rights and protections of any member of that house. Varanthus opened the case, revealing a silver band engraved with the same spiral and 7 stars that Dojin had seen on the crash ship in the entire history of the Valith sovereignty. Varanthus continued, "This status has never been granted to a non-Valith, but traditions exist to serve us, not to chain us. And I will not let tradition prevent me from doing what is right." He lifted the band and held it out to Dojin. "Kang Dojin, I declare you kinbound to House Varanthus, brother to me and uncle to my daughter. And I grant you the protection of my name and the welcome of my home for as long as you live." Dojin took the band with hands that trembled only slightly, feeling the weight of history in its silver surface. "I do not know what to say," he admitted. "You said everything that needed to be said when my officers asked why you saved my daughter," Varanthus replied. "And you said she was scared and needed help. And those words have haunted me since I heard them." He turned to address the assembled officers, his voice rising with passion. "We've spent centuries watching younger species from afar, judging them unworthy of our attention, convinced that our way of measured transaction and logical exchange was superior to their chaotic emotions. But this human has shown us something we had forgotten. He ran into fire for a stranger, suffered burns and wounds and nearly died, and when asked why, he could offer no reason except that she needed help. And that is not weakness or foolishness as we have been taught to believe, but a kind of strength we do not possess. Varanthas looked back at Dojin, and there was warmth in his ancient eyes. I have already sent word to the ruling council that I wish to open formal diplomatic relations with humanity, he said. Because if one human could act with such selfless courage, then perhaps your species deserves more than our silence. Sareth broke from her father's side and threw her arms around Dojin, holding him tight the way a child holds someone they love. Uncle, she said, using the Valith word that the translator rendered as something far more meaningful than the simple human term. You are family now. Dojin hugged her back, feeling the impossible lightness of her frame and the fierce strength of her grip. And he found that he had no words for what he was feeling 6 months later. Dojin stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The cabin was larger now, expanded with Valith technology that somehow blended perfectly with the rustic human construction. He had visitors more often these days, diplomatic envoys and curious Valith who wanted to meet the human who had changed there. If there chavers and tourists in this way. History, but his favorite visitor was the small blue figure who came bounding through the trees every few weeks, her silver eyes bright with excitement and her musical voice full of stories about her life among the Starserith. Loved the mountains, loved the snow and the cold air that had once nearly killed her, loved the simple human traditions that Dojin taught her with patient care today. She sat beside the fire he had built in the outdoor pit, watching the flames dance with an expression of wonder rather than fear. Will you teach me to build a fire? She asked. A safe one, like this. Of course, Dojin said, and he knelt beside her to show her how to arrange the kindling as they worked together. Sareth looked up at him with a question in her eyes. Do you think all humans would have done what you did? She asked, running into the fire for someone they did not know. Dojin considered the question carefully before answering. No, he said honestly. Not all humans would have done it, and we are not perfect. And we can be selfish and cruel and afraid just like any other species. Then why did you do it? Sareth Askedojan smiled and helped her strike the match that would light the carefully prepared fire. Because enough of us try, he said. And enough of us believe that kindness is worth the cost. And enough of us run toward danger when someone needs help. And maybe that is all that matters. The fire caught, small at first and then growing stronger. And Sareth watched it with pride in her eyes. My people are still learning to understand humans, she said softly. And many of them think you are strange and unpredictable and dangerous in ways they cannot calculate. What do you think? Dojin Askensareth leaned against him, her small body warm against his side, despite the chill mountain air. I think you are the best thing that ever happened to me, she said. And I think if more beings in this galaxy were like you, it would be a much better place. Dojin wrapped an arm around her and watched the fire they had built together. The alien child and the human who had become her family somewhere above them. The stars were full of civilizations that had never known kindness without cost. But that was changing now, one act of compassion at a time. And it had all started with a man who ran into fire because a child was scared and needed help. Perhaps that was what made humanity extraordinary, not their technology or their strength or their ambition, but the simple, stubborn belief that helping others was always worth the cost. The communication tower rose from the mountain peak like a silver needle piercing the clouds. And Dojin had never been so grateful to see anything in his entire life. He had lost track of how many hours they had been walking, his body running on nothing but determination and the desperate need to keep Sareth safe. The wound in his side had stopped bleeding at some point, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. And he chose not to think about it too careful. Lizareth had been supporting him for the last kilometer, her small frame somehow finding the strength to keep him upright when his legs threatened to give out. She should not have been able to bear his weight at all, given how fragile her species appeared. But fear and love could make anyone stronger than they believed. The tower's communication array hummed with power as Dojin activated it with shaking hands. He had to enter his ranger credentials 3 times before the system accepted them, his vision blurring at the edges as he fought to stay conscious. "Vileth military vessels in orbit," he said into the transmitter. "This is Kang Dojin, Colonial Ranger, and I have someone you are looking for." The response came faster than he expected. A clipped voice speaking accented human standard that identified itself as Officer Talandra of the Vileth Sovereignty. "You claim to have information about our missing asset," Talandra said. And Dojin noticed that she called Sareth an asset rather than a person. "I have your missing child," he corrected firmly. "Her name is Sareth, and she has been under my protection since I pulled her from her burning ship 4 days ago." There was a long pause, and then a different voice came through the channel, older and more authoritative. "This is Commander Valeth, and if you are telling the truth, then you will bring the child to the designated landing coordinates and surrender her to our custody immediately." "There are hostiles in the area," Dojin said. "Armed professionals who have already tried to kill her once. And I need extraction for both of us." "You are human," Valeth said, as if that explained everything. "You have no standing to make requests of the Valeth sovereignty. I just killed 3 assassins and walked through a blizzard with a hole in my side to get her here," Dojin said. And for the first time, he let his exhaustion show in his voice. "All I am asking is that you keep us both alive long enough to hand her over safely." Another pause. And then Valeth spoke again with reluctant respect in her voice. "A shuttle is being dispatched to your location, and you will both be taken into custody pending verification of your claims." The shuttle arrived an hour later. A sleek silver vessel that descended through the clouds like a falling star. Dojin stood with Sareth beside him, one hand on her shoulder to reassure her, and the other pressed against his wound to keep himself upright. The moment the shuttle touched down and its doors opened, everything changed. Vileth soldiers poured out in perfect formation, their weapons trained on Dojin with the kind of precision that suggested they would not miss. He raised his hand slowly, ignoring the spike of pain the movement caused, and let them take him without resistance. "He saved my life," Sareth shouted as they pulled him away from her. "He is not your enemy." "That remains to be determined," said the officer in charge. And Dojin was pushed into the shuttle and locked in a small holding cell before he could say another word. The flight to the orbiting warship passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion when they finally dragged him out of the shuttle and into a sterile detention facility. Dojin could barely stand on his own. They left his wound untreated, which told him everything he needed to know about how they viewed him to them. He was a potential threat at best and a criminal at worst, and his suffering meant nothing. Hours passed, or perhaps days, and Dojin lost track of time in the windowless cell. He was questioned repeatedly by Vileth officers who seemed unable to comprehend his actions. Their interrogation AI analyzed his responses and found no logical motivation for his behavior, had no prior relationship with the child, one officer said for the 3rd time, and no political or financial stake in her survival. "And yet you risked your life and suffered significant injury to protect her." "Yes," Dojin said simply. "Why?" the officer demanded. "Because she needed help," Dojin said, giving the same answer he had given every time. "And I was there." The officer shook her head and made a note on her datapad, and Dojin could see the word inconclusive written in alien script before she turned away alone in his cell. Dojin finally allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. He had done what he believed was right. and it had probably cost him his life. The Valeth had no reason to release him, and every reason to make an example of a human who had interfered with their internal affairs. But when he closed his eyes and thought of Sereth safe among her own people, he found that he could not regret his choices. The girl was alive, and that was enough. It had to be enough. The door to his cell opened suddenly, and 2 guards entered with expressions that gave nothing away. "You are being transferred," one of them said. And Dojin was too weak to resist as they pulled him to his feet and half-carried him through gleaming corridors that seemed to stretch forever. He expected another interrogation room, or perhaps an execution chamber if the Valith were efficient about such things. Instead, they brought him to a vast formal chamber filled with Valeth officers in ceremonial dress. At the far end of the room stood a figure in robes of deep purple, and beside him was Sereth, clean and healed, and watching Dojin with tears streaming down her blue cheeks. "That is him," she said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "That is the human who saved me." The robed figure stepped forward, and Dojin realized with a shock that he was looking at High Counselor Varanthus himself. Sareth's father was tall even for his species, with silver eyes that held the weight of centuries and the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room seem small. "I have read the reports," Varanthus said, his voice deep and resonant, "and I have heard my daughter's testimony, and I have reviewed the records of your interrogation, and I still do not understand." "There is nothing to understand," Dojin said, and he was surprised at how steady his voice remained. "She was in danger, and I could help. And so I did." "You are dying," Varanthus said bluntly. "The wound in your side has become infected, and without treatment you will not survive another day. And yet, when asked if you regret your actions, you said no." "I do not regret them," Dojin confirmed. Varanthus studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in those ancient silver eyes. "My people have watched humanity from afar for centuries," he said slowly, "and we have always considered your species to be primitive and violent and beneath our notice. But you have shown me something I did not expect to find." "What is that?" Dojin asked. "Hope," Varanthus said. And for the first time since entering the chamber, he smiled. He turned to his officers and issued a single command: "Save him." The morning of the 3rd day brought trouble, and Dojin watched it descend from the gray winter sky in the form of unmarked shuttles landing somewhere to the east. His monitoring equipment had been tracking their movements since they entered the atmosphere, and he knew with grim certainty that they were not the official Valith military. The military vessels were holding position in orbit, following proper protocols and waiting for clearance from the colonial government. These other ships had no such patience, and they had landed without authorization less than 10 kilometers from the crash site. "We need to move," Dojin said, already packing essential supplies into his largest bag. Sereth stood by the window, her translator device now working better after Dojin had managed some basic repairs with his limited tools. "They have found the crash site by now," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her silver eyes. "They will know I was not inside when it exploded, which means they will start searching the surrounding area," Dojin finished. "And we cannot be here when they do." He had already formed a plan during the long hours of the night when sleep refused to come. Official Valith military was his best chance of getting Sereth to safety, but they were in orbit and would not risk landing without proper diplomatic clearance. However, there was a colonial communication tower on the other side of the mountain range, powerful enough to reach orbit directly if he could get Sereth there. He could contact the military vessels himself and bring them down to retrieve her. The journey would take 2 days through rough terrain, and the weather showed no signs of improving, but it was the best option he had. "Can you walk?" he asked Sereth as he finished packing. "I can try," she said, and there was a determination in her voice that reminded him of the bravest soldiers he had known in his rescue days. They left the cabin as the first snow began to fall, and Dojin did not look back. He had lived in that small building for 5 years, finding peace in its solitude after the nightmares had become too much to bear around other people. But a building was just a building, and the child walking beside him was far more important than any structure of wood and stone. The first hours of travel were the hardest. Sirith's species was clearly not built for cold environments, and despite the layers of clothing Dojin had wrapped around her, she struggled with the freezing temperatures and thin mountain air. Her breathing grew labored on the steeper climbs, and her small legs could not match his pace through the deep snow. Without a word, Dojin lifted her onto his back and continued walking. "I am slowing you down," Sarith protested, her arms wrapped around his neck. "You should leave me and save yourself." "That is not going to happen," Dojin said firmly. "But it would be logical," she insisted. "My survival is uncertain, and your survival becomes more uncertain the longer you stay with me." "Logic is not everything," Dojin said, adjusting her weight on his back. "Sometimes you just do what is right, even when it does not make sense." Sarith fell silent, but he could feel her head resting against his shoulder, a small gesture of trust that meant more to him than words. They traveled through the day and into the evening, stopping only when the darkness made the path too dangerous to navigate. Dojin found a small cave in the mountainside and built a fire at its entrance to keep them warm through the night. His burns protested every movement, and the straps of his pack had rubbed them raw. But he said nothing as he prepared a simple meal for them both. "You are in pain," Sarith observed as they ate. "I have experienced worse," Dojin said. "Which was true enough among my people," Sarith said slowly. "The strong do not sacrifice for the weak, and those with power do not give it away for those without. And I have been taught that this is the natural order of things. Is that what you believe?" Dojin Askedsarith looked into the fire, her silver eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I do not know what I believe anymore," she admitted. "Everything I was taught says that what you are doing is foolish and wasteful. But everything I feel says that it is something else entirely." "What does it feel like?" Dojin asked gently. "It feels like being safe," Sarith whispered. "And I have never truly felt safe before." They slept close together that night for warmth, and Dojin found himself thinking of the daughter he had never had, the family he had never built, because his work had always come first. Perhaps that was why he had run into the fire without hesitation, because some part of him had been waiting his whole life for a child to save. The attack came on the second day, when they were descending into a valley that offered the shortest path to the communication tower. Dojin heard them before he saw them. The crunch of boots on snow that did not match his own footsteps. He set Sarith down behind a large rock and pulled his hunting rifle from its place on his pack. "Stay hidden and stay quiet," he whispered to her. "No matter what happens, do not come out until I tell you it is safe." There were 3 of them, wearing dark tactical gear with no insignia, moving through the trees in a search pattern that would have impressed any military unit. They were professionals, and Dojin knew he was outmatched in terms of training and equipment. But he had one advantage: they did knew this mountain like he knew his own heartbeat. Every slope and shadow and hidden path carved into his memory from years of solitary walking. The first attacker never saw him, and Dojin dropped him with a single shot from behind a fallen tree before moving to a new position. The other 2 scattered, taking cover and returning fire with weapons that made sounds he did not recognize. Energy bolts scorched the snow where he had been standing moments before, and he realized with grim clarity that their alien weapons were far more dangerous than his simple rifle. He led them through the forest, using every trick he had learned in his years as a ranger to stay one step ahead. He triggered a small avalanche that buried the second attacker under a wall of snow. Then circled back to catch the third from an unexpected angle, but the third was faster than he expected. And a bolt of energy caught Dojin in the side as he fired his final shot. Both of them went down. The attacker with a bullet through her shoulder, and Dojin with a burning wound that stole the breath from his lungs. He lay in the snow for a long moment, staring up at the gray sky and wondering if this was where his journey would end. Then he heard Sereth calling his name, and something deep inside him refused to give up. He pushed himself to his feet, one hand pressed against the wound in his side, and stumbled back toward where he had left her. She was crying when he reached her, the first tears he had seen from her since the crash. "You are hurt," she said, her hands reaching for him but afraid to touch. "You are hurt because of me. I am alive because of you," Dojin corrected her, though he could feel his strength fading with every heartbeat. "Now help me walk, because we still have a mountain to climb." They moved on through the falling snow, the wounded man and the alien child, leaving behind the bodies of those who had tried to kill them. The communication tower was still half a day away, and Dojin did not know if he had that much time left, but he kept walking, because Sereth was depending on him, and that was reason enough to take one more step. The sky above the mountain split open with fire and thunder as Kang Dojin stood on his cabin porch, watching the last light of evening fade behind the peaks. He had seen many things in his years as a ranger on this remote colony world, but nothing like the burning streak that tore across the clouds and plummeted toward the forest 3 kilometers to the east. The ground shook when it hit, and a column of smoke rose black against the darkening sky. Dojin set down his cup of tea and stared at the distant glow beginning to spread through the trees. Protocol was clear in situations like this, and he knew it well because he had memorized every regulation when he took this posting 5 years ago. Alien vessel crashes required military response, and civilians were ordered to stay away and report what they witnessed through official channels. He reached for his radio to make the call, but then he heard something that made him stop. Carried on the cold mountain wind came a sound so faint that most people would have missed it entirely, but Dojin had spent 15 years as an emergency responder before he came to this mountain, and he knew that sound better than any other in the world. It was a cry for help. His body moved before his mind could catch up, and he was already pulling on his heavy coat and grabbing his emergency pack when the rational part of his brain started listing all the reasons he should stay put. The vessel could explode at any moment, and the fuel these alien ships used was often toxic to humans, and he had no idea what kind of creature he might find inside. But the cry came again, thin and desperate, and Dojin was already running through the snow toward the orange glow bleeding through the forest. The cold air burned his lungs as he pushed through the trees, his boots breaking through the icy crust with each step. He had failed to save someone once, 3 years ago, in a building collapse that still visited him in his nightmares, and he had promised himself that he would never hesitate again, no matter the cost. The crash site was worse than he expected. The small spacecraft had torn a path through the ancient pines, leaving broken trees scattered like matchsticks before coming to rest against a massive boulder. Flames licked across the silver hull, and the heat hit Dojin like a wall even from 30 meters away. The alien symbols on the side of the vessel meant nothing to him, but he could see the emergency hatch near the back, partially buried in churned earth and snow. He pulled his coat up over his nose and mouth and ran toward the flames. The heat intensified with every step, and he could feel his exposed skin beginning to burn. But he pushed forward until he reached the hatch. It was sealed, the mechanism either jammed or locked from inside, and the metal was already hot enough to sear through his gloves. Dojin pulled his emergency tool from his pack and began cutting through the seal with desperate speed inside the vessel. The crying had stopped, and that terrified him more than anything else. the seal finally gave way, and he wrenched the hatch open with strength born from pure adrenaline. Smoke poured out, thick and acrid with chemicals he could not identify, and he held his breath as he climbed inside. The interior was small, meant for perhaps 2 or 3 passengers, and through the haze he could see a figure pinned beneath a fallen support beam near the front of the cabin. She was small, barely larger than a human child of 7 or 8 years, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow faintly in the flickering firelight. Her large silver eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment Dojin thought he was too late. Then she stirred, and those eyes opened, and he saw fear and confusion and desperate hope all at once. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out that he could understand. The fire was spreading inside the cabin now, the flames climbing the walls and reaching toward the ceiling. And Dojin knew they had seconds at most. He grabbed the support beam and pulled with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest as the metal slowly shifted. The alien child whimpered, and he could see that her delicate frame was not built for this kind of abuser species. Whatever they were, seemed fragile compared to humans, their bones thin and their skin almost translucent. The beam finally moved enough for him to pull her free, and he gathered her into his arms as gently as he could manage. She weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of hollow reeds, and she trembled against his chest as he turned back toward the hatch. The fire had reached the ceiling now, and pieces of burning material were falling around them like deadly rain. Dojan hunched over the child, shielding her with his body as he ran for the exit. Something struck his back, burning through his coat and searing his skin. But he did not stop. He threw himself through the hatch and kept running. The child clutched tight against him until he was 50 meters from the wreckage. The explosion knocked him off his feet and sent them both tumbling into a snowbank. Dojin rolled instinctively, keeping the child protected beneath him as debris rained down through the trees. When the noise finally faded, he lay still for a long moment, breathing hard and cataloging his injuries. His back burned with what felt like second-degree burns at least. His hands were blistered from the hot metal, and his lungs ached from the smoke, but he was alive, and more importantly, the child in his arms was still breathing. He sat up slowly and looked down at her. She was staring up at him with those enormous silver eyes, her expression one of complete bewilderment. Her hand reached up and touched his face, her fingers cold and impossibly delicate against his burned skin. She spoke again, a series of musical sounds that he could not understand, and he shook his head gently. "I do not know what you are saying," he said, keeping his voice soft and calm despite the pain radiating through his body. "But you are safe now, and I am going to take care of you." She seemed to understand his tone, if not his words, because some of the fear left her eyes. Dojan struggled to his feet, the child still cradled in his arms, and looked back at the burning wreckage of the spacecraft in the light of the flames. He could see the insignia painted on a piece of fallen hull, and recognition hit him like a second explosion. That symbol had been on every news broadcast for the past year. The elegant spiral surrounded by 7 stars that marked the ships and property of the Velith sovereignty. They were one of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy, and they were famous for 2 things: their incredible technology and their complete refusal to interact with younger species like humanity. And now Dojin stood in the snow of a remote mountain, holding what appeared to be a Velith child, with no idea how she had come to crash on this forgotten colony world, or who might be looking for her. The child shivered in his arms, and he pushed aside his racing thoughts. Whatever political complications awaited him could wait until morning right now. There was a scared and injured little girl who needed warmth and safety and care, and nothing else mattered. He turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, leaving the burning wreckage behind them as snow began to fall, covering their tracks 1 flake at a time. The cabin was warm when Dojin finally pushed through the door, and the child in his arms had stopped shivering somewhere. During the long walk through the forest, he carried her to the small couch near the fireplace, and laid her down as gently as he could. Then turned to add more wood to the dying flames. His back screamed with every movement, the burns pulling tight across his skin. But he ignored the pain and focused on what mattered most. The fire roared back to life, filling the cabin with golden light and blessed heat. Only then did Dojin allow himself to sit down and truly look at his unexpected guest. She was watching him with those remarkable silver eyes, tracking his every movement with an intensity that seemed far too sharp for a child up close. He could see details he had missed in the chaos of the rescue. Her blue skin had a faint pattern to it, like frost on a window, and her ears were longer than a human's, tapering to delicate points. She wore what looked like expensive clothing, now torn and stained with smoke. And around her neck hung a small device that blinked with a weak red light. The child noticed him looking at the device and touched it with thin fingers. She spoke again, that same musical language, and this time the device crackled and produced broken fragments of words he could almost understand. Translation unit, she said, her voice overlaid with static and gaps. Damaged in the impact. Dojin leaned forward, hope rising in his chest at the possibility of communication. Can you understand me? He asked slowly. The child tilted her head, listening as the device processed his words. Yes, she said after a moment. Understanding is possible, but speaking is difficult with damage. That is enough for now, Dojin said. And he found himself smiling despite everything. My name is Dojin, and you are safe here. Sereth, the child said, pointing to herself. I am called Sereth. Sereth, Dojin repeated, testing the name on his tongue. That is a beautiful name, and now Sereth. I need to look at your injuries, and then I need to treat my own. And then we can talk about what happened to you. The examination revealed that Sereth had been incredibly lucky. She had bruises along her ribs and a shallow cut on her arm. But nothing appeared to be broken. Despite the violence of the crash, her species was clearly fragile, her bones feeling almost hollow beneath his careful touch. But she had Servetidin treated her wounds first, using the medical supplies from his emergency kit. And only after she was bandaged and comfortable did he turn his attention to himself. The burns on his back were worse than he had thought, and treating them alone was an awkward and painful process that left him sweating and breathing hard when he finally finished. Sereth was watching him with that same bewildered expression she had worn in the snow. Why? She asked. The single word cutting through the quiet crackle of the fire. Dojin looked up from putting away his medical supplies and raised an eyebrow in question. Why did you run into fire? Sereth clarified, her device struggling with longer sentences. You did not know me, and I am not of your species. And you had no obligation. It was such a simple question. And yet something about the way she asked it suggested that the answer mattered deeply too. Dojin considered his words carefully before responding. You were scared and trapped and calling for help, he said simply. That is reason enough. Sarah's silver eyes widened, and she shook her head slowly as if his answer made no sense to her. Among my people, she said, the words coming slowly through her damaged translator. Help is given for payment or favor or political advantage, and no one runs into fire for a stranger, and no one suffers burns for someone they have never met. Dojin felt a deep sadness settle in his chest at her words. She was so young. And yet she had already learned that kindness came with a price tag. Humans are different, he said, though he knew that was not entirely true. Some of us believe that helping others is its own reward. I do not understand, Sereth admitted. That is okay, Dojin said with a gentle smile. You do not have to understand it to accept it. And right now you need rest. He prepared a simple meal from his supplies. giving Sareth the larger portion even though his own stomach was growling from the exertion of the rescue. She noticed this and frowned, but he waved off her protests and insisted that she needed the food more than he did. That night, he gave her his bed and made himself a place on the floor near the fire, using his coat as a blanket. Despite the burns that made every position painful, Sareth watched him from the bed, her expression troubled. "You give me the food and the bed and the blanket," she said quietly, "and you treat my wounds before your own, and you lie on the hard floor while I sleep in comfort. And I still do not understand." Dojin closed his eyes and tried to find a position that did not hurt. "You are a child far from home," he said, "and you have been through something terrible. And it is my job to take care of you until I can get you somewhere safe." "Is it truly your job?" Sareth asked. "Or is this something else?" "Maybe it is something else," Dojin admitted. "Maybe it is just what I believe is right." Sareth was quiet for a long moment. "My father is an important person," she finally said, and her voice was small and uncertain. "I was being taken somewhere secret because there are those who wish to harm me to hurt him. And I do not know if my guards survived the attack on our ship." Dojin opened his eyes and looked at her. Seeing for the first time the weight of fear she carried, she was not just a lost child, but a target. Someone whose very existence put her in danger. "I will not let anyone hurt you," he said. And he meant it with every fiber of his being. "You cannot promise that," Sareth said. "You do not know what is coming." "No," Dojin agreed. "But I can promise that I will try." The next morning, he used his Ranger communication equipment to report the crash through official channels. But when they asked if he had found any survivors, Dojin looked at the small blue figure sitting by his fire, wrapped in his blanket and watching him with trusting eyes. "No survivors," he said into the radio. The vessel was completely destroyed. He did not know if he could trust the authorities with Sareth's safety. Not when she had been shot down on her way to hiding, and not when he had no idea who her enemies might be until he knew more. He would keep her existence a secret as he ended the transmission. His equipment picked up chatter from orbit. Multiple vessels had entered the system, some with official Valeth military codes and others with no identification at all. They were all searching for something, and Dojin knew exactly what they wanted. The hunt had begun, and he and Sareth were running out of time.